Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Our guest today is Lucy Komisar, and we do a deep dive into the story behind the Magnitsky Hoax, as Lucy calls it. Lucy tells the story of Bill Browder, Hermitage, his hedge fund, and how he managed to create a massive political weapon called the Magnitsky Act to protect himself and his benefactors and to use against others. The story also involves shell companies, tax havens, money laundering, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Robert Maxwell, Gazprom, HSBC, Natalia Veselnitskaya and the Trump Tower meeting, the resurgence of the Cold War with Russia, Russiagate, the Mueller Report, and more. Lucy Komisar is a New York City-based journalist with a long history of investigating offshore banks and corporate secrecy and abuses. One of her current long-term projects is the investigation of the Browder Magnitsky Hoax. We recorded this on September 24th and 27th, 2019. We're talking to Lucy Komisar from New York, just up the road, 90 miles up the road. Hello, Lucy. Welcome
Hello.
Around the Empire. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
So Lucy got started with her investigation of Bill Browder and Hermitage Capital and all of this many years ago when she was investigating offshore corruption and shell companies, money laundering. Is that accurate, Lucy?
Yeah, the first time I encountered Bill Browder, it was in the year 2000 in Moscow, and I had gone there with a grant from an agency of the U.S. federal government to look into corruption in Russia, and particularly with an interest in the offshore system, which I had started looking into just a few years before. When I went to the Philippines and Zaire and Haiti on some other projects, just so curious it seemed to me that the oppositions, I was looking into movements for democratization, said to me in 3 different continents, the corrupt despot has looted the country and the money's all in Swiss banks. And I didn't know anything about Swiss banks. You'd hear about them in movies and then it would just pass off, money in Swiss banks. Well, I began to look into it, and it turned out to be the underlying dark financial system paralleling a lot of the real financial system, because a lot of these were run by major financial companies. They weren't just fly-by-nights. They were big deals. And I realized that this was, if there was crime committed, whether it be by a kleptocrat or a drug trafficker or a tax evader, the getaway car was being driven by the offshore banking system. That's how I got into that. And that's why I was interested in what was going on in various places. Russia was one. I was able to get that grant. I went to a meeting which was run by a Western law firm that was doing a lot of Western companies had set up in Moscow to try and see what they could get out of the system. And one of the speakers there was Bill Browder. And I had been hearing about a scam that he had run through a company, and I'd done some research on it, a company called Avisma. And this was a Russian titanium company, which Mikhail Khodorkovsky had gotten in one of the rigged auctions where his bank was actually running the auction, and of course he won. And he decided to sell it. And part of the way he was running it was he was using offshore. He'd gotten a crook named Peter Bond, who was notorious for this in the Isle of Man, to accept the trades of the titanium, the sales of titanium, to this company, which was just a shell at the Isle of Man, at a fake low price, and then sell it on the market for the real market price. Who got cheated? The minority investors, because Khodorkovsky didn't have the entire company. He had the majority. I think he had about 60%, but he had a majority. And the Russian tax authorities and the public, because the taxes and the dividends would be paid on the fake low rate. He decided he wanted to sell Avisma and get into the oil business, only in the oil business. He was already had Yukos, which he'd gotten in the same kind of rigged auction. So several people, one of them Browder, and some partners decided to buy his share. And part of the deal was they were going to keep the crooked transfer pricing, because that's what it's called, transfer pricing. And so they did. Then they decided to sell Avisma to a Russian company. The acronym is VSMPO, and that's a company that was using titanium in its production. Titanium, by the way, is used in airplanes and in other production. So they bought it, and they had a lawyer who has offices in Philadelphia and Moscow, and he went to look at the records, the law firm that was handling their work, which happened to be in London. And he said to me later, Lucy, I cannot believe that they let me see these files, because what happened was the following. Peter Bond, sometimes, the crooks are crooks even to the people they're doing business with. When you lie down with dogs, you get up with fleas. So Peter Bond was cheating them, Browder and his partners, and not giving them all the skimmed money. They went to court in the Isle of Man. Now, in the Isle of Man, the civil lawsuits are secret except for the parties. You cannot, as in the U.S., you can go in and on Pacer, you can find all kinds of civil lawsuits and all the documents. Not in the Isle of Man. Only the parties can see it. So they were not worried in saying in their suit, hey, they promised us we were going to get the skim, and he didn't give us the skim, and it's worth this much, and the deal wouldn't be interesting to us if we didn't have the skim. And Browder was saying, they're all saying this. By the way, if people look on my website, the Komisar Scoop, I did a long story about this, and I linked to all the key documents, including Browder's own transcripts he made of conversations with Peter Bond. So I asked him about the Avisma story, and he immediately attacked me and said, whenever I'm trying to fight against the corrupt bad guys, there are always people that are sent to attack me. Of course, that would have been me. But of course, he was the corrupt guy. That's when I first met him. So then I began to investigate this story more. It took quite a while for me to get all the documents. At one point, I ended up going to the lawyer's office in Philadelphia and spending the entire day scanning in, must have been about 10 cartons of legal documents. But that got me interested in him. So then when, and that story was published by 100 reporters, and nobody else in the U.S. would publish that story.
And 100 Reporters is a website, right?
It is. It's an investigative website. Mm-hmm. And they've done a number of my stories. They also did the next one, because as we, and the editor is named Diana Jean Shimo, we already knew that Browder was a crook. So when the story of the Magnitsky hoax came up, we knew he was a crook. And she said, yeah, do it, look into it. So I wrote that story, which showed how he had been cheating the Russians of taxes. This gets back into the material of the current event. So you might want to ask me particular questions, based on that. But the Avisma is really how I first got into the story.
Right. Yeah, just to back up a little bit. So today we're gonna talk about the Magnitsky sanctions, or as people who understand it sometimes call it. If people are wondering where we're going with this, it's sort of, I don't know, you could say the center of it is what some people who are in the know, call the Magnitsky hoax, as Lucy said, or the Magnitsky myth. And in an article, Lucy describes it as, quote, a transatlantic dispute over offshore accounts and tax evasion, and a U.S.-born investor, William Browder, who once ran the largest foreign investment fund in Russia, and who plays the eminence Grise in this drama.
Grise.
Oh, Grise?
Eminence
okay.
Grise, it means the gray eminence.
Oh, I thought it was, okay, thank you for that. Eminence Grise. So, and it has grown into a very large global drama. And just to kind of clue everybody in, not only that, it also happens to explain or help explain some of the things that we've been dealing with in recent years with this persistent drive toward the resurgence of a Cold War with Russia and the Trump-Russia debacle, otherwise known as Russiagate. And we're going to try to stay at a fairly high level on this story for our opening episode for those who aren't familiar with the situation. As I've told Lucy, I've been following this story from a distance, but I've not done any episodes on it yet until this one. And although I always intended to. So it's an important story, and there's a lot of intrigue that's drawn me in. And clearly it has with Lucy. She's been intrigued by it for a couple of decades now. But it's also a very complicated and now a very convoluted story, too, because of the way that Browder has spun it. And I'd like to get to the gist of it today without getting too far into the weeds. But unfortunately, you have to go into the weeds to really understand it. But, that's for later. Lucy and I and some others have been talking about how in some upcoming episodes we can bring you a lot of this story and how it ties into some other big stories. So I'll just tease a little bit with that. And I'm personally a bit intimidated by the whole thing, but there are some awesome experts who want to do it. So stay tuned for that. But for now, we're going to continue with Browder and the Magnitsky myth, if you will. And we're going to skim the surface of it. And so let's go back a little bit, Lucy, to, who is Bill Browder? Who is he? And why does he seem to show up at every turn? And why are all these media companies, he's on the media all the time. He seems to have a lot of power. And it's curious. We don't, a lot of people don't even know who he is. So let's start with the points that you gave me. Let's talk just a little bit about where he came from.
Well, he was born in Princeton. He grew up with his family in Chicago. It was a very high-achieving academic family. They were professors mostly of math, including at Princeton. And then he went to Stanford. But instead of going into teaching or the academy or research, he turned to business. And his real interest then was making money. And just as a young man, one of his first jobs was working for Robert Maxwell.
Oh, really?
Yeah. First, he was working for the Boston Consulting Group in Mayfair in London. He decided to go to London. And then he worked for Maxwell's MCC conglomerate. Now, Maxwell's a pretty famous guy. He ended up drowning off his boat. It's very suspicious circumstances. He had also basically stolen the pension funds of the employees of his various companies. And if the name is familiar, that's because his daughter is the one who was working with Jeffrey Epstein to abuse, rape, destroy the lives of young women. She was basically the madam. Then he worked for the London offices of the U.S. investment bank Salomon Brothers. And he worked on a big deal for Salomon. It was the telecom Peter Star, but he never mentions that in the book he wrote or any place else, probably because it was the subject of a massive corruption investigation. And a telecommunications minister in Russia had to resign. So his big deal, he's always talking about how he has big deals, that was his the big deal. Then he got money from Edmond Safra, who owned the Republic National Bank. He lived in Monaco. And a guy named Beny Steinmetz, who's an Israeli, and he was recently charged by the U.S. and some European countries with bribery to get control of some mines in Guinea. So he has some very dicey investors. They gave him money, and information I have most recently is they were really behind setting up of Hermitage. He was the guy, the front man for it, and he ended up taking it over. But they appeared to have been the first ones. What's interesting is Safra's Republic National Bank is the bank through which $4.1 billion in IMF loans went to Russia in 1998, supposedly they had been in a big crisis, and it disappeared. And people think it disappeared somehow, routed through the Republic National Bank of Safra, and Safra was the $25 million investor of of Hermitage. The investment came a few years before that. So it's not that that money went in, but the suggestion is that this was a pretty dicey guy. Both of his two investors, Safra, who died in a suspicious fire in about 1999, and Beny Steinmetz, who's now is charged with bribery, both of them were very suspicious figures, and those were the people who bankrolled his operation. And he set it up with the help of Mossack Fonseca, the famous firm that is known through the Panama Papers.
Right.
And so they set up this firm, and it was going to buy shares of Russian stocks. Initially, it was for the two big investors, and when they left by the year 2000, they'd pretty much gone out. And Browder, it was Browder and some other big investors that were there. The main investors were the Ziff Brothers, and they are the people that own Ziff Media, a very big media conglomeration.
Yeah, Ziff
So
Davis,
here he is in the late 90s, early 2000s, and he is buying shares of Russian companies.
Right.
Now, the other main thing that is important to know, and this gets back to my interest in offshore, because that's how I got interested in him, doing things offshore. What they did was they set up a network of shell companies in Russia with Russian nominee owners, that is, fake owners. They just got people to give their names.
And Lucy, this is back when the the shock therapy, when after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Russia was transforming into a free market economy, so-called, right?
Right, and a lot of people went over there to see what they could do. He even brags about how initially there was something called they were giving out the shares to all the members of the public, but people didn't know what they were getting. They were getting papers that allowed them to X% of X companies, and people like Browder were buying them up on the cheap so that they could get a big share of major companies. That was the first thing. And he brags about it, how these poor people didn't know that they were being fleeced, and they were fleeced.
Literally poor, and in some cases, it was a terrible economic time for Russia at that point. So these people were desperate, actually.
Yes, and they were desperate, and they sold their shares for a pittance, and people like Browder made out like bandits. So then there are two things. One, that's how they got a lot of the shares, but they did something else that was very interesting, also related to offshore. A place like Cyprus, which is where a lot of rich Russians have stashed money that they moved out of the country, is one of the bank secrecy havens. It's one of these places where you can set up a company, a shell company, without your real name. You can have a bank account without your real name. And they set up companies and bank accounts in Cyprus. Now, the reason for that is the following. Two reasons. One is they wanted to buy Gazprom. Gazprom is the big energy company, the major energy company of Russia. But Russia didn't want the West to take it over. So they had a ruling, the company had a ruling for a while, and the government had a ruling for a while. They overlapped, but it was during the time Browder was wanting to buy the stocks, that only Russians could buy the stocks in Russia. Now, foreigners could buy them as what are called ADRs, American Depository Receipts, in London, but you have to pay more, and you are limited in what you can have. And if you want to get a certain percentage of the company, you have to get approval from the company. And the government, of course, would be looking over these things. So what they did was they set up many shell companies in Russia with fake Russian owners and bought these shares that they were not legally supposed to have.
Right.
Well, they needed to get them out. So there were two reasons that they were going to need Cyprus. They wanted to move those shares out of Russia. And also, Russia and Cyprus had a dual taxation treaty. That is, if you were a resident, a legitimate person, a company or person in Cyprus, and you had an investment in Russia. Suppose the investment made money. Normally, if you make money in a country, you pay taxes on your profits in that country. But if they brought the money back to Cyprus, maybe Cyprus would say, oh, you're in Cyprus and you have to pay taxes in Cyprus on what you have earned. The U.S. does the same. The U.S., wherever you earn money, you have to pay taxes in the U.S. The U.S. has double taxation treaties, so you don't pay the tax in two places. So if you were a legitimate resident of or company in Cyprus and you had Russian shares and they made profits, the normal tax in Russia would be 15% profits tax, pretty low. In Cyprus, with double taxation, you could pay 5%. But Cyprus was just a pass-through. There weren't any real Cypriots that owned any of these companies. It was a fake. It was a fake.
Right.
So he'd set up this system of shell companies, both to buy shares that were not legitimate for him to buy, and then to cheat on the taxes.
Now, he also gave up his U.S. citizenship to avoid taxes too, right? Isn't he technically
That's in 98, yes.
A UK
exactly.
citizen too?
So, yes, that is true, because he would have had to pay taxes on his income. And even if there are double taxation treaties, if you're a guy who doesn't want to pay any taxes, that's not good enough.
Yeah.
There was one other tax area that I want to mention, and this has to do with the companies in Kalmykia, which is a region in Russia where he set up his Russian shells. They had a system where they were concerned about people who were disabled, and they were concerned, especially there were people who fought in the war in Afghanistan and were disabled. So if a company hired 50% of their workers disabled, you would get a very big tax write-off. Also, if a company invested in the region, you'd get another big tax write-off. So Browder put in that he had hired these people. However, these were just shell companies that held shares of stocks. He didn't have any employees. He made that up. He paid some people a small amount of money to use their working papers. And finally, when they were investigated, they admitted, well, it was discovered that they had real working papers for other places. They were manual laborers, and they actually had other jobs. And this is, in the same way that your Social Security follows you, and you can figure out where you're working because the job pays your Social Security. Well, the working papers in Russia also, it makes it possible to figure out where you're really working, because those people have to pay into. So they were all these several people who later testified, and they were working at other places. So he was lying and cheated again. So he was brought to court. At first it was a local arbitration court. And they said, yeah, you owe all this money. It was in the millions of dollars. It was, I think, for the couple of companies, it went to 40 million. If you added the Gazprom later, when they found that was another 30 million. And since then, they have, as they investigate, they have found more. I've seen a lot of the documents. They're very heavy documents. So he figured, hey, they're really after me, and I'm not going to win here because they have me. They have the goods on me. So that's when the Magnitsky story was born. Magnitsky was interrogated in 2006 about, he was the tax guy who was arranging the tax cheating. He had actually recruited the people whose working papers were bought, were rented. Right. And when the government found out about it, the investigators found out about it, he was called to give testimony in 2006, and that's so they already knew then what was going on, and Browder was getting worried. He had lost his visa in 2005 because several years had gone by, and he hadn't been paying the taxes. He'd been ordered to pay the taxes by local courts. He refused to pay the taxes. Then they found out about Gazprom. He's really they said in one paper that he was a national security threat. Yeah, he actually tried to get on the board of Gazprom.
Right, and
control Gazprom. Of course, he was a national security threat. So they they didn't let him come back in the country. They didn't renew his visa, which he complained about very angrily, even though he tried to get Medvedev, who was, I guess, must have been the prime minister.
He had to step in as president because Putin could only serve a certain number of
tried to get him to let him back in, but look, this guy was trying to steal into the major company for national security, power, gas, oil, so on. He was a national security threat, so he couldn't get back in.
Yeah.
And then now there's concern now. Magnitsky is being investigated for these same scams. So Browder is getting very worried.
And at this point, because now we're into the early 2000s, and you mentioned, and I think it's an important point, that Browder he used to say, he used to flatter Vladimir Putin, and he used to, it seemed like he was friendly with him. Now he says that he's Putin's number one enemy, and Putin is the devil incarnate. But, during this period of time in the 90s, this chaos, both economic and in almost every other way in Russia, there were a lot of oligarchs rising up, and these oligarchs were working with Americans, Brits, other people to try to extract all the wealth that they could out of the formerly publicly owned assets of the country, right? So, but it was in 2000 when Vladimir Putin came into power, and supposedly he laid down the law. They were starting to get a hold of things, trying to get things under control, and to keep from bleeding all of their assets and capital flight and everything from completely destroying the country, which seemed to be some people's goal. So Putin at that point supposedly, rounded up the oligarchs and said, look, you can keep your wealth, but don't buy the government. And he's trying to get things, and he's trying to stop the bleeding, per se. So at this point, Browder still thinks that he can get Russia to sort of drop these cases against him right before 2005, when it kind of all, he gets kicked out of the country, and then he has to work through a proxy, Magnitsky. Is that sort of accurate?
Magnitsky was not really his proxy, but he was his accountant. He was the one that was handling he had other people there. He had other people from his company that were there. But Magnitsky was the one who was targeted, was named by the government because he'd been the one who'd actually been filing these. He was responsible for the tax returns that were the fraudulent tax returns.
But they're on to him now, right? They're starting to crack down, and they're trying to actually recover some of, hold some people accountable, like the taxes in this case. But overall, they're trying to, stem the bleeding and actually trying to correct some of the problems as well, and hold on to their major companies, their major state assets. And this is when Browder switches strategies. And
at first he said, he actually was quoted in the Washington Post saying Putin was a true reformer and the one ally of the Western capitalists who came to Russia to create a new market economy. And he was pretty good at sucking up. He said these kinds of things at Davos, and he made a PowerPoint about it. But Putin is not so dumb. Well, the next thing that happens, which actually gives him his, using another phrase, his deus ex machina, his way out, his invention of how to get out of the system. Part of the investigation required that the investigators, the tax authorities, look into the documents that were in his office and the office of his accountant, Firestone Duncan. So in June of 2007, where they are still investigating, they go into the offices and they take papers, documents, some computer drives. It's actually pretty normal when investigators think a company is up to be no good. They come and they get your documents. One of the things that sort of the funny thing about this is Browder was always big on PowerPoints. Made a PowerPoint which he gave to newspaper people in about 2 years later, uh, as he's doing his propaganda about the events. And he has a picture, a graphic of police coming into the office of Firestone Duncan. And it shows it's just stick figures beating up a guy who he says is his lawyer, and he gives the name of the lawyer. And then he puts the picture of the guy in the hospital. Well, what's very funny is a little investigation. The guy turns out to be a 1961 U.S. freedom writer named Jim Swerg. It's his picture. And I found him. I found the guy. Oh. And I showed him this, and he was very generous. He's a guy who then had gone into the ministry and done a lot of good works, working for nonprofits. And he half laughed and said, this guy doesn't seem to be the brightest bulb, because it turned out those pictures were in Montgomery Advertiser, which is Montgomery is where he was beaten up as a freedom rider. But they were in the Washington Post. They were all over the world on the front page. And so Browder and his friends pretends that this guy is his beaten up lawyer in Moscow in 2007. Now, anybody that sees that and doesn't know that this guy is really a con man, and not always a smart con man, but what he did, nothing happened at that time. That was 2007. Magnitsky is interrogated twice in 2008, and then he is arrested in 2009 because apparently they discover that he has applied for a visa to go to England, and they feel that he's going to flee, so he gets arrested and gets put in prison, and he is there for quite a while. Now, one thing that has happened in the meantime is that sometime after the documents were taken out, HSBC, which is the trustee for Browder's Hermitage Fund, and HSBC has been known to be a little crooked. That was the bank that ran the accounts for major Latin American drug traffickers.
Ties to BCCI, right?
So therefore, he obviously chose well. It turns out that, and this was confirmed by the controller of HSBC under oath, that they put in a document saying they needed to increase their legal fund another $7 million in order to get back companies that were stolen. That was in July. These documents were taken in June. No companies were reported stolen. Browder says he found out companies, he had several shell companies. He said he found out they were stolen in October. That's in his book. How could HSBC be putting aside $7 million to deal with a legal case in July when Browder doesn't admit that he found out about it? He says he found out about it 3 months later. July, August, September, October. What happened there? So there's a little suspicion that is raised. How come they know about this? Now, what this relates to the tax refund fraud. So you have to look at this. This is complicated. What happens is, and I spoke to a lawyer, a Russian lawyer, who admitted that he was involved with some of the crooks doing this. He said, yeah, they did this for a while. There were a bunch of professionals like me. We had various clients. Then the government got wise to it and stopped. But at that time, they would have some fake companies, more shell companies, that would sue the companies owned by the crook, whoever it was, and say, you had a contract with us and you didn't fulfill it. And as a result, we have lost a huge amount of money and we are now suing you for that amount of money. Well, it turns out that the amount they're suing is the total of the profit the company made in that year. And so that's what they did with a company called Renaissance. Its leaders are now based in London. And with Browder. They did the Renaissance. He told me, the guy, Andrei Pavlov, I wrote about him in one of my stories. He said we did that for Renaissance in 2006. And then in the Browder companies in 2007. Now, he doesn't say that Browder was behind it, and Browder says his companies were stolen by other people. Of course, what HSBC knows and what he then knows only in October raises some questions. So whoever was running these companies applied for a tax refund because all of their total taxes, which were about $1 billion, had now been eaten up by the fact they had to pay out this money.
All the lawsuit money, right?
On the lawsuit.
It's like, we made this much profit. Oops, someone sued us for that amount of money and we can't pay any taxes.
Exactly. So that's why it's called the tax refund fraud. They demanded $230 million refund, which they had paid in taxes, the tax refund fraud. It went into a couple of banks in Moscow, and then it went out of the country through a whole lot of banks, and nobody could ever really find it. Browder says that 1.9 million of the 230 million ended up in accounts that were used by a company called Previzon and a guy named Denis Katsev. That was less than 1%. And he supposedly knew all about this because the guy's father happened to be an official, of course, and he could never find any of the other money, except every once in a while Browder and OCCRP, which is his acolyte news organization, supposedly investigative news organization based in Romania, they come up and with the announcement that X million has been found in this bank. Danske Bank was one of the victims. X million has been found in that bank. This 230 million made a lot of stops along the way. Of course, there's no evidence for this, but whenever he says it, he gets on television in the local country. He gets in the newspapers. And he gets on TV in the U.S. all the time. Nobody ever asks for evidence.
And framed as a white hat, as the good guy. He's always
the good guy.
Yeah.
He has found this, and then he's complaining. Just happened that Austria, he announced that some bank had gotten this money, and the Austrian official said, "Well, we looked into it. There's nothing there." And he attacked the government of the officials in Austria who did that. They're crooked. But we looked at it. There's nothing there. He spoke at a committee of the London Parliament, and he was complaining. He said the officials here, the authorities that are supposedly the investigators into wrongdoing, they're calling me a pain in the ass, which is true. So, there are cases. He's made a lot of charges. That's what, and he's actually his system, and he actually has said this. There was somebody did a Harvard Business School review about him and his tactics. And what he does is he makes charges. He says there's a lot of ink when I make the charges. A lot of attention is paid, but these reporters, they don't really have time to look into it. And then it drops, and nobody writes about that. But so his tactic is to make charges with no evidence, to to know, as he has said, that the reporters are lazy and they're not going to check out anything. They're just going to write about what he says. The reporters are Browder stenographers. Basically, They're Browder stenographers. But so what happened was, so this thing happened. This money has gone out there. Begins to be an investigation, and this is in 2008. And there's something in a newspaper called there's a newspaper in Russia, and they write about that. And there is a woman named Rimma Starova.
Right.
Now, she looks at the newspaper, and then she gets worried because she is now the director of the shell company, one of the shell companies that had disappeared, and she worries that they are going to get to her. And so she goes to the authorities. Her name is Rimma Starova.
And it's a British Islands shell company, right? British Virgin Islands, sorry.
Well, no, that's an owner of several. She works for Boyle Systems, a British Virgin Islands shell company, which has taken over these other Browder companies, and we don't know whether they're still owned by them. But she goes to the authorities, and it's in April of '08. Browder finds out about it because there is a report that he later puts out he puts out a press release. He then deletes it, but it's on the Wayback Machine. And he knows that she has gone to these authorities. So a couple of months later, in July, his lawyer makes a complaint about this scam. She's suggesting what's happening with the scam. And then later, Magnitsky, in his last testimony in October, so we've got first April, then July, then October, he says there was a scam where some companies were taken over. But by then, the press release, the September press release, which later would be erased, that was already out. He doesn't say this till October. He's the one that's going to be called the whistleblower, except you really can't be a whistleblower if the whistle has been blown in April and July and September. But of course, the newspapers, American and other, that write about this will never look into the real evidence. Browder will say he's a whistleblower. Ergo, he's a whistleblower. We are your stenographers. So he gets arrested. And Browder, by the way, then, and the conditions are terrible. The conditions in Russian jails are not like Scandinavian jails. They were pretty bad. And it was a very old building. It was over 100 years. It was in bad shape. So he's having bad conditions. However, there's an interesting little piece of the story. A guy named Oleg Lurie. He's a Russian journalist, investigative journalist. I happened to have met him in 2000 when I was in Moscow because we were both looking into the theft of the 4 plus billion through the bank, through the Safra's bank. And so I had gone to see him because I heard he was looking into it. Well, he turns out to be in jail because a corrupt member of the Duma has accused him of false charges. I think it was that he was blackmailing him, but he wasn't. And in the end, it is discovered that the guy's lying, and he is exonerated. And actually, the judge or the prosecutor apologizes to him. But meanwhile, he's in prison. He meets Magnitsky, and first
in prison, right?
In prison, because there he is. And the reason he meets him is sometimes people have to go to court or to a doctor or some reason to take them out of their cell. For some reason, they go into this common room. Maybe they're meeting a lawyer, and there's a common room where they have to wait until they're brought into the place where they can talk to their lawyer. So that's where some of the inmates get to talk to each other more than just to their cellmate. And so Magnitsky came up to him because he was known as the journalist. He would be helping other people. He was a smart guy. And so Magnitsky came up to him and told him about what was going on. But he said his employers were going to get him out. And he was very hopeful. And they were going to get him out, and he was going to go to England. Then Lurie sees him for the second and last time, and he is very depressed. He says his employers were betraying him. They want him to sign statements about a case that had nothing to do with his charges. His charges were the tax evasion, the Kalmykia tax evasion. And he says they want him to make an accusation about the tax refund fraud and to say that officials did it, and that's why they arrested him. And of course, it's a total lie because he had never accused any of the officials of anything before he was in jail. He had said something about this matter that some companies had been stolen, but he never accused any officials. Browder just made that up. But of course, this is reported all over because, the Browder stenographers were not going to look. There's actual testimony that you can see on Pacer where all the legal papers are filed. And this was part of the Prevezon case. But no, they were not interested. So, and then he dies. Meanwhile, someone from one of the human rights groups who has been going to the prison to check out things never sees Magnitsky because she is never told that he is somebody that you should check on. No, he is nowhere of interest. And Browder gives a statement at the House Human Rights Commission which McGovern, Representative Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, is a co-chair of, and most of the time is talking about his problem with his companies. This is in 2009, and Magnitsky is in jail. Later, he would say, oh, he was being tortured every day. He never mentions this in his testimony.
In front of the Human Rights
Committee. Front of the Human Rights Committee. There's nothing about that. Forget that. But finally, in November of 2009, he dies. Magnitsky dies. He has terrible pancreatitis. He gets terrible treatment, terrible medical treatment, and he dies. And there is an NGO named the Public Oversight Commission in Moscow, and it is charged with investigating prison conditions, and that would include why people will die in prison. So they go in immediately, like within days, to investigate. They talk to a lot of people, and they put out a very detailed report, which I also have on my website, and you could find it on the internet. But they put out this report, and it basically says terrible conditions, and he died of pancreatitis, and so this is in late 2009. So Magnitsky is dead. The Russians are still after Browder for his tax evasion. He's gotten various, they found him guilty in various times. Various agencies have found him guilty. He's trying to deal with this. Well, he gets the help of a guy named Jonathan Weiner. Weiner is a guy who used to work for John Kerry, worked for the State Department, and then went to work for APCO, which is an international an international public relations organization whose client also was Khodorkovsky. And Weiner, they figure out a scam, a story that they are going to tell. Now, first, after the death, Browder has talked about this case, and at the university, at various places, including another Human Rights Commission report, he talks about that he got bad medical care. He at the University of San Diego Law School, he says the same thing. He got terrible medical care. At Chatham House, which is in London, an elite foreign policy think tank, he says he got terrible medical care, and he died. Then, when the Weiner and Browder get together, they invent another story. And at the University of Cambridge Business School, in the end of 2011, remember, for 2 years he's been telling a different story, they put him in an isolation cell, tied him to a bed, allowed 8 guards to beat him with rubber baton for 1 hour and 18 minutes till he was dead. In some places, he said the assault lasted for 8 hours, but then he dropped it to 1 hour, 18 minutes, because that seemed a little unusual, that it would take that long to kill for 8 people to kill somebody. And the State Department would pick it up. And the reason was, Weiner said, look, there's something in law which I was involved in putting in, and it says that collaboration. There's something called an MLAT, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. It's countries to collaborate on sharing information about criminal cases. And there was something put in, and he said he was responsible. This doesn't operate if there are political reasons for the case. So they have to invent the political reason for the case so that the Americans will not collaborate with the Russians, and neither will other Europeans, particularly the Brits, because he moved his, he was in England. Some of the money would have been moved there. So they invent the Magnitsky hoax. And the Magnitsky hoax is that this guy, number one, was, and he said to CBS, he was tortured every day. He never said that when he was before a House committee talking about his own problems. And he never made any complaints about it. And human rights groups never said anything about it while Magnitsky was in prison, because, look, if a guy's being beaten every day and tortured every day, don't you think you'd get some human rights groups to say something? Nothing. He invents the other story, and nobody asks the obvious question, like, how are you inventing this 2 years later?
Yeah.
So these are the Magnitsky lies. and it included some forgeries, interestingly, because there was in the Public Oversight Commission report, which I obtained because it was on Pacer for the Prevezon case. He added in a paragraph that Magnitsky is saying that he was arrested because these officials, because he knew that they were involved in this crime, and that's why they arrested him. It's not in the true one. It's in the fake one. And actually, this fake one, you can find it on the Wall Street Journal website. They include the fake one, which includes that fake paragraph. And when he was asked to explain later about it, he said, well, the result is it's a clerical oversight, really, that invented paragraph. So, because it wasn't in the Russian. It was only in his translation. And the Russian...
He provides a translation, and he conveniently adds this little bit in, and people don't get their own translation. They just accept his.
If they went to Pacer, where the translations are notarized by the translator.
So there is another.
There is another one. That's the one I have. It's the one that's on Pacer. That doesn't have the paragraph. Isn't that interesting? It doesn't have the paragraph. So when he's asked, how come the real one, if there's no paragraph like this? Well, he said it was dropped. What he's trying to say is it was in the original Russian, but it was dropped because of a clerical error. Now, if you believe that, I have a bridge in Brooklyn I can tell you. But of course, the reporters that are looking into this don't bother to look at Pacer, which they could easily get, or they could get it on my website. They don't have to then pay for it on Pacer. But this is all used to promote the Magnitsky Act. And the Magnitsky Act targets people who he says were involved in the death of Magnitsky, the death by eight guards beating him with truncheons. And he names a lot of people. Some of them are people who are just people who were tax investigators. They were not prison people. If you want to talk about a death in prison, let's talk about the people in prison who are responsible, right, for the death in prison.
But they happen to be people who are going after him for the tax evasion, right?
Exactly. People in court are named on this list. An early partner of his name is Ponomarov. He was an early partner of Jameson Firestone, who ran the Firestone Duncan company that handled Browder's tax evasion. I interviewed him. He left the company. He was basically forced out in a scam by Firestone Duncan, which was written about in the Russian press, an extortion threat. And so he left in about 98, 99, way before any of this happened. He was put on the list. He was put on the European list. Browder got the European Parliament to make a list. He was put on the list. He had nothing to do with any of this. I mean, he left the Firestone Duncan 10 years before the tax refund fraud, 12 years before Magnitsky was arrested. He's put on the list. I mean, the whole thing is so fake.
Right.
And so all of this goes on. And I tried to get the State Department, which was under the law, they had some responsibility for this list. And I said, can you, and they also put out a human rights report, which they do every year on every country, except probably the U.S. And they said a lot of terrible things about Russia, including what happened to Magnitsky. So I contacted the State Department. And I said, can you give me, you said XYZ, he was beaten up, this and this. Can you give me the evidence that you used? And I have the email from this guy, which is really very funny. He said, we do a lot of research when we do these reports. We do a lot of research, but none of this is meant to be for the court of law. He refused to give me any evidence and basically told me what we said will not stand up in a court of law. Of course not. There's no evidence. But that is what the Magnitsky Act is based on, this kind of thing. Now, I think that some of the people are lazy and stupid. I put the reporters in that category. Some of the people in government are using this as he's their convenient guy to run our Russophobic foreign policy. let's say that, we have to say that Putin and everybody around him are pretty much monsters. They beat this guy to death. We have all these people that were complicit in it, and that's why we should have sanctions, and that's why we do all these things. It's all part of a much bigger story. Browder was the useful idiot. Maybe he's not such an idiot. Let's say Browder was the useful con man. He was the con man trying to protect himself.
He's the operator. Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's dumb, but yeah.
No, he's a useful con man, but he's useful to, why should the U.S. government care? Why should people like Adam Schiff, the Democrat from California, who's one of the major Russophobes, why should they care about this? They don't care about him. I don't know. Is he paying people off? He's known to, it's believed that he pays some people off because OCCRP, this is the Organized Crime and Corruption Project, which Browder acknowledges in his deposition to U.S. federal court, worked with him on putting out the documents about how the money was stolen. That is, they basically created them. So we know that they work together. So they start doing this around in 2012. So according to, and this is in the Browder deposition, he's asked about this. He's asked, OCCRP in about 2011, they had a budget of about 19,000. Then the next year, they have a budget of 1 million point something. 1 million. And he nothing to do
priority.
With me,
yeah.
Just a coincidence. He's there suggesting that Browder paid them off. Some of the money could be coming from Magnitsky. Do you know that the Magnitsky Act has a section about Khodorkovsky? I'm sorry, not Magnitsky. Khodorkovsky was also a crook. And actually, this Magnitsky Act, which Khodorkovsky has nothing to do with, but there's evidence that he paid for the lobbying because you have some of the reporting came from shell companies that he had, and they were paying for the lobbying. But Khodorkovsky has a section in there protecting him against the Russians.
Yeah.
Going after him for thievery. So this is basically a
protection racket.
A Russian
of some sort.
It's a protection racket. This is a protection, a Browder Khodorkovsky protection racket. And we don't know.
And whoever else is, yeah.
Well, that's who's in there now. And I would love somebody to see where their financial contributions are going to these people that are supporting them. The main ones are a governor in Massachusetts, Ben Cardin, a senator in Maryland, and McCain, who died, but he was another big supporter of Browder and the Magnitsky Act.
And the one guy who's not he's the former U.S. attorney in Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, right?
Yes, exactly. He was he's the guy that signed off on it. So. And he's very political. We know he takes cases for their political interest. So he signed off on this. And it was 2012 that the U.S. brought the Prevezon case, which was basically, they were acting as proxy lawyers for Browder, because this would be one of the arguments that Browder would make, that this was part of the whole deal against him and against Magnitsky. They were not allowed to bring in the Magnitsky story to the case because there was no evidence that it had anything to do. I mean, he was investigated before this happened. And he never, although Browder lies about it, he never says that there was any collusion of the lawmen, the tax investigators who arrested him. So there was no evidence. And you can't put in evidence in a U.S. federal court case unless you can show the judge that it's legitimate. And basically, they didn't put that in. What's interesting that happened, there was just a ruling by the European Court on Human Rights, which was brought by a lawyer paid by Browder. And they wanted the court to say that Russia was guilty of terrible things for arresting Magnitsky and so on. Well, it turns out the whole first section is that the Russians had every good reason to arrest Magnitsky. Every good reason. They had evidence, they had the tax evasion evidence, that evidence that he was going to, that he asked for a visa to go to England. They had every good evidence. The second part, which has to do with the tax refund fraud, is full of Browder lies, which I wrote about on my website, and basically pointed to all the evidence that showed that they were lying. They were just using Browder's statements without checking them out. But it's really quite interesting that they said that there was every good reason to arrest him. So in the end, the U.S. government, there was a settlement for the Russians. It was costing them millions of dollars to defend this. Lawyers are expensive. And they wanted to stop it for that reason. Now, the government has very deep pockets. Why would they want to stop it? They could have a big victory. Why have a settlement? And the settlement was going to be for about $6 million, which I thought the company figured they're going to spend at least that much more in legal fees. But why would the Justice Department stop this with their deep pockets? They could get the big victory that they want, that the Russians did all these terrible things. Why did they stop it? They didn't have the evidence.
Falling apart, yeah.
They didn't. Well, the evidence of that money was going from here to there. They could. You have to. They were making all kinds of claims that the money from the tax refund fraud ended up in the accounts of this guy, but they couldn't prove it.
Right.
They couldn't prove it, and that was going to happen. That they were going to be shown that this whole thing was a fake. It is a fake, but that's what happened. But the Magnitsky Act continues in spite of various things, in spite of the government not being willing to continue the case, in spite of this ruling by the European Court of Human Rights that Magnitsky was justly arrested. The other funny part, and you should get Andrei Nekrasov on. He's the guy who did the film on the Magnitsky case behind the scenes. Very good film that in English. He's a Russian, but it's in English. And Browder had it banned from the European Parliament, and he has prevented it from being shown on the major European TV stations that paid for it in Germany and Russia, where the TV stations financed this film, and they also got money in Norway. The TV stations refused to run it because Browder is threatening lawsuits. But one of the things...
I watched it on Vimeo. I don't know if it's still available on Vimeo, but
yes.
I was able to watch it there. Yeah.
And one of the things he discovered, which was great, was he found out about the cell that Magnitsky was supposedly in at the time that he was beaten to death. And he found out that you couldn't fit all those people in the cell.
Yeah, a lot of details that really didn't jive, yeah.
Yeah. So it was all a fake, but Browder's way of dealing with these issues is to prevent the truth from getting out by legal cases.
Let's pick this up in the next episode. We're back. Lucy Komisar. We're going to continue our discussion on the Magnitsky myth. And hi, Lucy. Thanks for coming back to continue this conversation.
I'm glad to be here and talk about it.
So I think where we left off, we were going to talk about Ken Delanian's reporting on Bill Browder, his attempted reporting, and then his it was shut down, and his follow-up reporting. And this is a pretty interesting story. Why don't you tell us about this?
Ken Delanian is a national security reporter for NBC News in Washington. He had gotten on to the Browder hoax and had been investigating it and had been trying to get an interview with Browder and was communicating with him by email and both asking particular questions, asking for an interview, which he was never granted, but then saying, well, what about this? And asking a lot of questions and indicating the evidence that he had that Browder was a liar. And finally, he was about to broadcast his expose of Browder as a tax evader and a liar in May 2016. He had told him that we know that Magnitsky was not your lawyer. He was the accountant that did your tax evasion. We know that you falsified, basically forged some documents where you say that Magnitsky accused some tax authority officials of going after him, and because he had exposed them for the tax refund fraud we talked about in your last broadcast, this corrupt scheme, and Browder said Magnitsky accused these people of doing it, and that's why they arrested him. And there's actually something in Public Oversight Commission report, which was the investigation of Magnitsky's death in prison, where there's a paragraph where he says, and I know that they were going after me for this reason. Well, Talanian says, yeah, we have a copy of that, but our Russian translators looked at the original, and that paragraph is not in the original, where you say that Magnitsky, in this a report that's put out by a Russian NGO, and they're saying, and Magnitsky said, that's why they arrested me, it wasn't there. And Browder finally says on the email, oh, it must have been a clerical error. Well, it wasn't a clerical error, because there was another part that Deladian found out about, which was on the website. Browder has some links to Magnitsky testimony, the testimony of the interrogations when he was being investigated by the Russians for his participation in Browder's tax evasion. He was not yet arrested. And in the URL that is printed on Browder's website, it says, in this testimony, Magnitsky says, he's accusing them, he's saying this, and then two of them, he said, each of them where he's accusing them of going after him for this reason. Well, when you click through from the URL on the website, all you get is some Russian and a very, very little bit. You get no translation, so you really don't know what he's saying. Well, we do know what he was really saying in this testimony, because it was filed in the Prevazon case in U.S. federal court. And you can get this on Pacer. Pacer is the public access website that anybody can get documents from. And if you look at that, there were three different testimonies in October 06, in April, and October 08. None of them say anything like what this URL says. And Delaney is saying, this is not true. What you said is not true.
Do we know if Delanian figured that out on his own, or if someone tipped him?
I don't know. He may have had sources, but if you're doing the investigation, you follow all the leads, and he had at NBC Russian translators, and they could see that there was nothing the second part, you don't even have to know Russian, because you can see that the URL label is a fake, because you can get the real testimony from the U.S. government, the court records. Now, how do I know all of this? Because what happened was in May of 2016, he told Browder, we're going public with this broadcast. It's going to be a blockbuster broadcast. Browder's lawyers send a legal letter threatening NBC with a lawsuit. NBC is part of the multi-billion-dollar Comcast organization. It caves in. I'm a little suspicious of that, because a multi-billion-dollar company doesn't have to worry about a lawsuit, especially since Delanian have everything right. Now, how do I know?
Delanian's reputation too.
Yes, but he had everything right, because I read the legal letter, and all the things they say there are lies, and Delanian knows that, and he's got the evidence. Now, the question is, how do I know that? I know that because Browder was looping into all the email conversations a man named Robert Otto, a Russian expert, the major Russian expert at the State Department, part of INR, which means Intelligence and Research. He was getting the emails, and he was communicating separately to other people, his boss in the State Department, to other individuals. His emails were hacked. His emails were hacked and were put on a website. And it started to move in the underground of people who are looking for evidence of stories when they know that the mainstream media is writing lies.
Yeah.
So I got this information. I got all the emails. I got the emails between Delanian and Browder. I got the Otto emails. Now, some of them are really interesting. First of all, they included Delanian's very detailed questions about Hermitage tax evasion, the tax refund fraud, the death of Magnitsky, and the fraudulent translations of Russian documents. So Otto jokes to his boss, John Williams, because he now believes that Browder is fake. He said he believes that Browder has become like the legend of Liberty Valance, the film.
Yeah.
He wrote in an email, "I am beginning to feel we are all just a part of Browder's PR machine. When I wrote the note on the meeting with him, I ended with the Untouchables. Here I will just quote from the man who shot Liberty Valance. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." So what he's saying is the Browder story is an invention. It's taken on its own life, but the State Department found it politically convenient because it was part of the Russophobia. They're ramping up hostility to Russia. None of this story has been told in the mainstream media. Even the major alternative media, they have not. And I know this, and they don't want to, because I've tried to get it printed in alternative media and in major media. They are not interested in this story. This is a big challenge to a pillar, a small pillar, but an important pillar of Russophobia, the whole Browder Magnitsky hoax. And this shows that the State Department knew it was a hoax, that Robert Otto knew it was a hoax, that, interesting, at the time that the hack was done, a Foreign Policy magazine, which is a mainstream, I guess I would say neoliberal, neocon, they're not writing articles against Russophobia. They wrote that there had been a hack of a State Department official. They did not say the name of the person. They did not say the subject of the hack. They did not say anything about it. But if you go back, and you can find on their website that there was a hack. Well, of course, if you're a magazine with reporters, you try to find out what is this all about. Wouldn't you think that foreign
I'd want to see the
magazine,
emails. I'd go look for
they
them.
don't want to know. Why did they put that in there? That I'm curious about that. Maybe just to tell people that, look, we really know what's going on, but we're not going to tell you. We're not going to tell you what's going on.
It is very odd.
And then what was funny, I tried to get information. When I found out, I tried to get information from Delanian. He wouldn't talk to me. He wants his job. He's got a very nice job, and I'm sure he's got a nice paycheck. And he doesn't want to challenge that and say, hey, NBC killed my story. However, when my story for 100 Reporters came out about Browder, and remember, his issue was in the spring of 2016. My story came out in the fall of 2017, so it's a year and a half later. He put up a Twitter message to his people telling them to go to my site and read my article, that it was a pretty good article. I found that fascinating.
Well, it sounds like he's still angry that they shut down that story.
But it also, I think, he really worked hard on that story. He believes in the story, and he wanted the information to get out, even if he couldn't put it out. Now, this has another impact, aside from the fact that this would have been the first mainstream report that the Browder was a fake. 1 month after, that's May 2016, this happened, 2016. In June 2016 is the Trump Tower meeting, where Natalia Veselnitskaya, the Russian lawyer who's representing Prevezon, which has been accused of getting money in the tax refund fraud, she's trying to persuade the son of Trump and Jared Kushner that the Magnitsky Act is a fake because Browder is a fake, and that she's come to argue with them about that. When they hear that, there's a guy who's a British publicist that had arranged the meeting, and he had said some things which he later admitted were not true, that she had dirt on Hillary Clinton, and that's why they should talk to her. Well, it wasn't true. He admitted it wasn't true. So
let me just mention here that that's Rob Goldstone, and to hear his side of the story, Michael Tracy did a long interview with him that's worth listening to if you're in, because it is an interesting story, and if you want to hear it in his own words, that's a good place to get it. So, sorry, yes. Lucy.
So when they found out that that's not what she came for, they cut off the meeting after maybe 20 minutes. But that is why she came for. Now, if there had been a big expose by NBC 1 month before saying Browder is a fake, Magnitsky killing, and that was the basis of the Magnitsky Act. That's what she was there for. It would have been a totally different game. She might not have needed that meeting. It would have been a very public issue then. She
It
wouldn't
would
have
have.
to have a closed meeting with these guys at the Trump Tower Hotel. If you didn't have that, you might not have had some of the other things that happened. The Mueller investigation, many things came from the Trump Tower
Yeah.
meeting. Mueller, in fact, indicated it was one of the 6 major events that he and his staff investigated. So it goes back to NBC killing the Delanian report.
Well, you know what else? One of the other motivations, like by May of 2016, when they killed Delanian's story, the Russiagate narrative was maybe already forming at that point,
Yeah.
and they knew. Well, now the Trump Tower meeting had not even happened at that point, so it's certainly another reason why they wouldn't want, because it's not like they didn't have, 1,000 opportunities to talk about that Trump Tower meeting. Everyone was curious about it. It was one of the top stories in the country for a long time, and it kept coming back and back. So there were so many opportunities to talk about what really happened at that meeting and, what she really talked about. So it just shows you how strong the motivation was for them to keep that narrative. And at that point, it helped Bill Browder. Nobody wanted to expose his narrative. So he really kind of, benefited from that a lot.
About the meeting, it wasn't that hard to find out what happened at the meeting. At the Judiciary Committee hearing in 2017, which would be after a year or so after the meeting, she sent written testimony. It pretty much tracks what Paul Manafort had in his notes of the meeting, because he was the other person at the meeting, and he took notes on his phone. And those notes also were given to the Judiciary Committee. If you look at his notes, they perfectly track what she sent them, because she must have had, it's like having a stump speech. That's what she told the people at the Trump Tower. It's what she told the Judiciary Committee. She was giving her stump speech about, this is how the Browder story and the Magnitsky story are fakes. And that would have made it clear. But people didn't, even then, when the Manafort's notes were available and her testimony was available, they didn't write about it. I did, but I'm not in the mainstream media. They didn't write about, well, this is really what they were talking about at the Trump Tower meeting, because they would have had to talk about the fact that the Browder story is a fake, and that's what the discussion was about.
Now, on whose behalf was she lobbying against the Magnitsky Act?
I don't know if she was being paid by Prevezon. She was representing Prevezon and Dennis Katzov, the owner of Prevezon, which is a real estate holding company, in the case in New York, U.S. federal court in New York. Browder had accused, it was brought by the Justice Department, but they were really acting as Browder's lawyers, because he was promoting his story of the theft of the tax refund, which came to his companies, which he said had been stolen by others. And then he said, well, we tracked where the money went, and out of the $230 million, we tracked $1.9 million to this guy. That's less than 1%. So the State Department goes after this guy, mostly because his father is a railroad official in the Putin administration. So you're not going to just go after a guy who has no connection, even by birth, to somebody who's connected to Putin. So that's why they picked on him. So, and she was the lawyer. She's a Russian. She was the lawyer, and on that case in New York, working with American lawyers. But I think, I don't know whether those people who were paying her for this were paying her to go and talk to the Trump people, because what's interesting is that Katzov, the owner, he was never even put on anybody's Magnitsky list. He had nothing to do with the prosecution or the death of Magnitsky. So why was Browder going after him? Well, he's going after him, as I said, because his father was an official in the Putin administration, and they're basically banging on this drum of terrible Putin, and that's what that was about. It was a very political lawsuit. Why she was going then after Browder and the Magnitsky Act, I think it's because she knew that Browder is the guy who had targeted her client. The State Department had no reason. By the way, he said he had all this information about where the money went. How come they only found 1.9 million out of 230 million? That's all they found. He had all this information, and the U.S. has the possibility of getting information from other countries, but they never went after anybody. So I think that she was trying to get the Trump people to go after Browder, because Browder was really the person who had targeted her client. So I don't know who pays her salary on this. That I don't know, but maybe they did. Maybe they agreed to do that.
Because there are some other odd things about the Trump Tower. I think for a while there, they said the story was that she was lobbying on behalf to, allow adoptions again, which I know, like that part sounded okay to me, because I remember Stephen Cohen in his many weekly interviews on the radio, he had a number of times he had suggested, he's really worried about the breakdown of the relations between the United States and Russia. And he's like, well, one thing that you could do to just put forth like a bit of goodwill is to allow adoptions again and, get that mechanism to make it legal again, because I guess the Russians had shut that down.
Well, it was reaction was quid pro quo. You do something where they targeted people that, I mean, if you want to say the people responsible for killing Magnitsky, it's got to be the people in the prison. They were targeting investigators, judges, all kinds of officials, and there were some people that weren't officials, that had nothing to do with Magnitsky. It was basically a star chamber with no due diligence, no way for anybody to say, "You're accusing me of what?" No, there were no accusations. They were just there as victims, as Browder's victims, as part of the Russiagate conspiracy. And I think the Russians feel, unless you do something, we're not going to do something. And in fact, well, I think they also banned some people. It was sort of funny that Mike McFaul, who's a former U.S. ambassador to Russia, and very much a Russophobe, buddies with Browder, he got banned, and he's really unhappy because he teaches about Russia, and he can't go to Russia now. So it's a big problem if you're a professor dealing with Russia and you can't go to Russia. But look, he deserves it. In his book, he spoke at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I asked him about him supporting the Magnitsky Act, and he said, "Well, read my book." So I got from his publicist, of course, a copy of the book, and it's got a section where he's talking about talking to Browder about the Magnitsky Act, and he said, "Well, there's a problem that there's no due diligence." It's which, of course, is true, and Browder was not interested in changing it. And he said, and then McFaul says, "Well, good luck anyway." So
yeah,
that it was that he did put up that in his book, and he was honest about that. But it seems to me a human rights law, which this purports to be, has to have due diligence. Otherwise, it's a fraud.
Yeah, very much so. And then the other interesting thing about the Trump Tower meeting and Veselnitskaya is that day she met with Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS, because they were working together on the Prevezon case. And yet he's also part of the dossier. I mean, that was really strange. So well, Delaney
the meeting is, if you're living in Moscow and you come to New York, you arrange to have all the meetings you need to have, in however many few days you're going to be there. That is not surprising to me. If I was going someplace to a faraway city and there were a bunch of people I wanted to meet, of course I would meet them all one after the other in those few days. That's not surprising. Now, Glenn Simpson was doing research for the law firm, the first law firm, because she ended up having two, because Browder knocked out the first one, for Baker Hostetler. He was hired, and this is common, a law firm that's defending a client in a case like this, hires researchers to get information, to get evidence. And in this case, a lot of it was evidence about Browder, because Browder really was the real prosecutor. The government was a proxy of Browder's.
Yeah.
So of course that's why she was that the law firm had hired Glenn Simpson to go and do research on Browder. This is not surprising, but the Simpson firm has numerous clients, and the people that work there have an overlapping expertise. So it's not surprising that if you have people with an expertise, perhaps in some Russia subjects, you are going to get clients, various clients, who want to take advantage of that expertise. So I think it's a coincidence that he got involved in the steel issue as well as the Prevezon case. I don't see any real connection to them. I just see that he and his law firm want to have clients, and these were available clients.
Yeah, this is one of those things where, you've been doing investigative journalism for a long time, where one of the things you have to be careful about connecting the dots is that, they don't always connect. You got to be careful not to connect ones that really don't. But I guess Delanian's reporting on this in November 2017.
No, it was his reporting. Oh yeah, he did and write something later. You're right.
Yeah, and he reports that Veselnitskaya says that she first received, I'll quote her, Veselnitskaya says she first received the supposedly incriminating information she brought to Trump Tower, describing alleged tax evasion and donations to Democrats from Glenn Simpson, the Fusion GPS owner, who had been hired to conduct research in a New York federal court case.
Well, that's exactly what I was talking about.
Right. So, and then, but
because
Fusion,
she would not have been able to investigate things like contributions to campaigns. She's sitting in Moscow. She doesn't really, know how you do this. Glenn Simpson knows how to do it. So, of course, that's what happened.
Oh, so that's what you're saying about the researchers. But then Fusion GPS, they seem to back off when they say, we didn't know anything about this Trump Tower meeting. Well, okay, yeah. You didn't
that's not backing off. The fact that they gave her information, of course they would give her information. There's an ongoing case.
For the court case.
It doesn't mean they know she's going to be having a Trump Tower meeting. One has
Right.
nothing to do with. They were giving her information before and after the meeting. That was what they were paid to do.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't know what she's doing with any particular bit of information they're giving her.
Yeah. Yeah, it just makes it even more interesting. It's I guess I buy all that. And
there's a web of things that happen, but one thing doesn't lead to the other. They were hired long before the Trump Tower meeting was in anybody's imagination. They were giving her information because they were hired by Baker Hostetler. They would be giving it to the Baker Hostetler lawyers, but her client was paying Baker Hostetler. So of course they would be sharing with her that information. That's natural.
And basically, if Goldstone had not, used this fake lore to get the meeting in the first place of saying that he had Hillary Clinton dirt on Hillary Clinton or Hillary Clinton emails or whatever, then this would have been just business as usual.
They wouldn't have given the meeting. As soon as they
true.
found out what the subject was, they ended the meeting. They wouldn't have had the meeting.
Yeah, true. I don't know, that Trump, just the way that worked out, it's almost like everything that could go wrong did go wrong, or became, it just became a very curious detail that then the Russiagate people really capitalized on with their narrative.
Part of the problem was once they couldn't show that Trump had colluded with Russians to do some bad things to swing the election, they had to find something else. And the something else was, we asked you about this meeting and you didn't tell us the truth. Well, they hadn't. There were emails that they found. And if you talk to people separately, some of them will tell you X. And then when you speak to the other person, if he doesn't tell you X, he's already in big trouble. So part of it was they were getting them on things that had nothing to do with doing anything wrong. They were all process things. You didn't show us this email. You didn't tell us about X. And that's what happened with that meeting. The meeting became poisonous, not because of anything that was said there, but only because of not telling everything that was related to setting it up. that's what the Mueller people went after, because
Yeah,
they
I
had
mean,
nothing else to go after.
yeah, they dug through everything that they had and just cobbled this thing together. And
Yeah.
I believe they initially found out about this meeting from emails that the Trump campaign,
Yes.
he released all of the Trump campaign emails to them. He gave them everything. And so whatever they found in it, and they patched it all
What's
together. But
interesting is part of what she told the Trump group was that Browder's big clients at that time were the Ziff Brothers. This is from Ziff Media, very major media company in the U.S. for years, that they had invested in Russian shares through Browder's Hermitage company in a way that disguised the money they brought into the buying the shares as loans so that they could evade U.S. taxes. Uh, I don't see any investigation by U.S. authorities, by U.S. media into the Ziff Brothers, that they, if that's true, they broke the law because the money was disguised as loans. She knows some of this because they have obtained a lot of documentation about the Browder operations. I've seen some of this. They were able to get documents from banks that were used by Browder and the Ziffs to move money and shares in and out of Russia, a lot of it was through Cyprus, which was also a tax evasion mechanism. And so they were able, particularly when the banks were in Russia, and they went in and said, we're doing a criminal investigation. We want to see your records. And they saw a lot of records. So they could see how the money was working. But I don't see and this is against the law to invest in something if you're an investment company in New York or in the U.S. and say, this wasn't an investment, it was a loan. She says it wasn't. Why isn't anybody looking into that?
right.
And then she said that they made donations to the Democrats. It was written they made donations to Clinton. Well, she's assuming that if you make in the campaign donations to the Democrats, it's going to the Clinton campaign. And anybody could find their public campaign finance logs on the internet, and anybody can find if the Ziffs made donations to the Democrats, that's there. It's not a secret. But it sounded until you get down to the bottom of it and say, well, this is actually a very not unusual statement, as if this was some kind of, did she make this up? Was it inside information? No, it wasn't inside information. Just go on the internet and look at the public campaign finance logs. But that was also part of what she said. So what she said, and if you read again the Judiciary Committee report that she sent, which is pretty much what she told the Trump Tower, makes a lot of sense. There's nothing strange about it. But this would not be something that the Mueller people would want to look at because there was nothing scandalous there.
Right. And that's a good time. That's a good way to segue into the Mueller report itself and the whole Russiagate investigation. Because, yeah, that it seems like someone should have been able to figure out the whole scheme with the Ziff brothers. But, with all of the subpoenas that they did and all the lawyers they had and all the investigation and all the everything they went through, you would think that they would have also been able to figure out the truth about the Browder story. But apparently they didn't, right?
Right. The Mueller report repeats the Browder fakery. And by the way, they call the Trump Tower meeting a key event. So therefore, you would think they would want to get to the bottom of what it was all about.
Exactly.
They didn't look into what the lawyer Veselnitskaya told them. They don't talk about her charges of Browder's tax evasion, her claim that the Ziffs were cheating, and they repeat the Browder fabrications, which basically his story about the killing of his so-called lawyer who wasn't his lawyer. And the stories show, I was really amazed. They spent a couple of years, millions of dollars, and how can they get everything so wrong? It looks like they never looked into any of the real evidence.
Yeah, well,
Okay,
I
so
have my doubts about that, but yeah.
well, for example, the fact that she claimed the Magnitsky Act was built on the fraud, that there was nothing true about it. And she made a lot of charges about Browder. They never looked into that. And then what they actually repeated all the fakery. They cited, quote, the Magnitsky Act, which imposed financial sanctions and travel restrictions on Russian officials, and which was named for a Russian tax specialist who exposed a fraud and later died in Russian prison. But he didn't expose anything. He was detained for his part in the tax evasion, and the exposing of the tax refund fraud was really by Rimma Starova, a Russian who was the fake name of a company to which Browder's shell companies had been transferred. And I talked a little bit about this in the other broadcast, but it's important here because the Mueller report gets it wrong. They say he's a whistleblower. In fact, she had seen something in Komisar, which is a Russian paper, that there was an investigation of the theft of these companies, and she was worried it would get traced to her because she was the fake name of the shell holding the companies. She went to authorities and started talking about that the theft of these companies. It was really very dicey. It was connected to people that owned the Cyprus shell companies. They started investigating all of this, and there was even then a report in the New York Times in July, and this is of '08. Well, Magnitsky never mentioned this until the October, that's 3 months later, interrogation. He's still not in prison, and he mentioned something about the tax refund fraud. Well, how is he then a whistleblower? It's exposed first in April and then a July testimony to the Russian police, then in the New York Times and the Russian paper Vedomosti after that. And how is he a whistleblower? These things are easy to find. I find it, right. And I don't have millions of dollars and a huge staff. How come the Mueller people could not find that Magnitsky was not a whistleblower?
Well, it sounds like they decided to print the legend too. But, they're investigators. They're not reporters or storytellers. I mean,
investigators are supposed to get the information. They don't have to put it in our wonderful prose, but they should have the information. And to say that this guy was a whistleblower meant they were just taking down what somebody, maybe they interviewed Browder or some people in the State Department, told them, because there is no evidence for that. The report said Browder hired Magnitsky to investigate tax fraud by Russian officials, and Magnitsky was charged with helping Browder embezzle money, as if the reason he was charged with embezzlement was the first part. Well, Browder didn't hire him to investigate tax fraud. That was in '07. He hired him in '97. He was actually working for the accounting firm Browder hired to do his taxes. How could the Mueller report get 10 years wrong and say they hired him to investigate tax fraud when he hired him 10 years earlier to be his accountant? You just have to look in the Prevazon case. The records are all on PACER, which is the government. It's public access to court records. Anybody can get them. And the testimony of Magnitsky is there. And he's listed as an auditor, and nothing about an investigator. Browder says he's his lawyer. He's listed as an auditor. And then he says, therefore, he's charged with helping Browder embezzle money. Well, it's very interesting that the European Court on Human Rights just came out with a report in which they said that the Russians were absolutely right to arrest Magnitsky because all the evidence was there, basically that he was the guy that was doing the tax evasion.
Right.
Absolutely right. If they are saying that, but somehow the Mueller report could not look into the fact that this guy had been hired 10 years earlier. He was the auditor, and he'd been doing the tax evasion. But they don't seem to know that. So I didn't investigate all the other parts of the Mueller report. But if they are so bad on this whole important key section, they call it, on Browder, you have to wonder about the rest of it.
Right.
Because the Mueller report seems to keep the myth of collusion in the air while dismissing any collusion takes place and using things like the Trump Tower meeting as part of the fakery because it doesn't want to tell what it was really about, and it throws in some of the Browder hoax story maybe just for good measure.
Well, yeah, And that's what I was thinking too. I mean, it really, there are a number of things that undermine the credibility of the Mueller report, but this is a big one, and it should call into question the whole report. I mean, I understand why the Mueller investigators didn't want to put the true Magnitsky story in here. Their foundations were, well, look, the Trump campaign had so many contacts with Russians. That was one of their sort of easy to understand things for the public. So I can see why the Trump Tower meeting narrative and avoiding the truth about the Magnitsky story was avoided. But yeah, it's just another thing. And you know who else credibility it undermines? All of the Senate and House committees who talked about this. Even in their, when they had Mueller come in to testify, nobody thought to ask that. Nobody thought to ask it. I just, that's sad. It just, it really, I already have a lot of problems with the Mueller report, but this one just really, this is a big one. And like you said, no one wants to touch it. It's really amazing. But I'm glad you're getting it out there. But all the opportunities, the missed opportunities to bring this up, and there are a number of things that just would basically just tear the Russiagate narrative into shreds, and this is one of them. But anyway, and we know Ken Delanian knows about it. That's interesting. I wonder if at some point, if he really is angry that story was shut down and he knows the truth, you wonder if he's ever going to get it out. I doubt that, but hey, you never know.
Not while he's still there. There's an interesting part of the NBC story. A guy named William Arkin, a number of months ago, he had been an analyst for NBC for years.
Yeah.
Remember that he resigned and he put out a public letter of why he was resigning? He was resigning because he basically said, NBC is an arm of the State Department. You cannot really talk about things. You can't tell the truth on it. He was very frustrated. NBC is an arm of the State Department. And he quit after maybe 20, 30 years. I think it is an arm of the State Department. It's not that they are officially getting their orders every morning from the State Department. You will put this on the air today. But in effect, they act almost as if they were, and they're not going to put on a story that's going to hurt a major part of the State Department's narrative. Russophobia is now State Department policy, and why would an NBC is part of that general group of people in the media who are Russophobic and basically take their marching orders from the government, not officially, not a phone call every day or an email, but they know how to do that. And I think that's part of it. And I think that Delanian was very frustrated, but he's a guy who has an important job and probably pays a lot of money. And I think that if he left it for some reason, he might tell the story then.
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure. There was a list of all the people that the Mueller team interviewed. Do you know if they interviewed Browder?
I don't recall. I don't know either. I don't think I saw that list.
Yeah. There are a lot of people they didn't bother to interview, like Julian Assange. They didn't even bother to talk to him. Amazing. Anyway, we have one last point here in your notes, the point 24, the U.S. courts on December 2018. Should we go through that before we wrap up?
Okay. So the story is not over. The Russians tried Browder in 2013, and he was found guilty. At this point, it became criminal. Initially, they were just charges that were heard in an arbitration court in Kalmykia, the region where he had his companies, and it was just, it's a tax case and a civil case. He never paid anything. He went on and on, even continuing to do what he was doing, fakery, corruption of not paying taxes, filing wrong taxes, not paying the fines, the judgments that came. And so then it became a criminal case. And they found him guilty, and they sentenced him to 7 years in prison and a fine. And of course, he was out of the country by then. But there's a new charges that the Russians filed in December. And this is interesting to me because it's not just the tax evasion charges, because as they look into more, they find more. Fraudulent bankruptcy in order to get out of the tax evasion charges. The shell companies that he had used to buy and sell the shares that taxes weren't paid on, profit taxes weren't paid on, he fraudulently bankrupted them. So you can't go after a company when it doesn't exist anymore. And of course, they were owned by shells that were in Cyprus, that were owned by shells that were in other tax havens. So they are now also charging him with embezzlement from the Russian treasury, added on to the tax evasion and fake bankruptcy. Well, that means that they are prepared to prove that he was the perpetrator of the 2007 $230 million tax refund fraud. They say in their charges, it's on my website in English if anybody wanted to look at it, at the Komisar scoop. The charge says Magnitsky was one of the tax refund fraud organizers, that he worked with a criminal group, including two of the people, Markelov and Klebnikov, who served 5 years in prison for the crime. And they say the group was managed by Browder. Now that's interesting, because if you're going to say this in court, you better have some evidence.
Yeah.
And the only thing I had heard from a guy named Andrei Pavlov, who I interviewed, and he's a Russian lawyer, and he admitted that he was involved in filing the fake papers for the tax refund fraud. That's where a bunch of shell companies sue your companies and say, we had a contract, you were going to do this, you didn't do it, we've therefore lost $1 million or $1 billion. We are suing you. And then your companies say, oh yes, you're so right, we are paying you what you asked for. Then they go to the tax authority and say, we had X profits last year, now we have zero because we had to pay this money to these people that sued us. We are asking for our full return of a tax that we paid. That's the tax refund fraud. So he said he did it for a group called Renaissance that Browder had some connection to, and then he did it for the Browder companies. Browder says they were stolen from him, so he had nothing to do with it. However, Pavlov told me that one of the guys that was imprisoned, just mentioned his name Markelov, told him that when he was organizing this, he needed documents from these Browder shell companies, and the person that came to his offices to give him documents was named Sergei Leonidovich. He didn't know the last name. Well, Sergei Leonidovich was Sergei Leonidovich Magnitsky. That is a suggestion that Magnitsky was really involved. Now, the question is, was it just Magnitsky and Firestone Duncan, his accounting firm, or was Browder also involved? Now the Russians seem to be saying Browder was also involved. What Browder has now done in response, he filed a petition in U.S. court in New York, U.S. federal court, asking for documents from 13 U.S. banks to get records he said would prove that some Russian officials stole some of that tax refund fraud and that it went through Citibank and J.P. Morgan in New York. That's interesting. I've never seen those banks named. Browder has said a lot about money moving here and there. He never really said where did it end up. But then the filing said, well, they can get evidence that the transfers came from originally in Russia, from those banks in Russia, where we know they did first go, because that's where the Russian treasury sent the money, to two banks in Russia. But the filing says we can't get evidence of how it tracked from Russia. We can just get the end result, millions of dollars channeled through these New York banks to their beneficiaries. But without the data of the intervening transfers, how can he prove that the money in the two Moscow banks can be traced to these accounts in New York? There were a lot of other fabrications in this filing that he filed, and easily proved, but this, I wonder now how he would argue that. So the story is not over. There will be a case in Moscow. Most likely, he will not go back to Moscow to answer the case, but the fact that he is doing this, that he did this filing, is very interesting, which means he's not going to ignore this case. So the story is not over. I'll be interested to see how this is being reported now. Of course, the mainstream press did not report any of what I just told you, but I'm interested when it gets to a point where it could get more specific. The Russians, there will be a case. He may not show up, but they may say X, Y, Z, and this is the evidence that we have. And maybe Mark Helloff will be required to testify. He's already done his 5 years in prison. And he may say, yeah, the person who I worked with was Sergei Leonidovich. Now, he would have to have some evidence. They can't investigate Sergei because he's dead. And some people have said that the death of Magnitsky did not do anything good for Russia or any particular Russians. He was already in prison, and they would have benefited by him living, because then if there was a trial, when there was a trial, he would have been required to testify. He was detained there. At that point, they had not had the case tried. It wasn't tried till 2013. He died in 2009. They would have benefited from him living. There's no evidence. Now some are saying, well, Browder had him killed. I haven't seen yet evidence. I do think that he was killed from really terrible medical treatment, but it was not to the benefit of the Russians. Having him alive and testifying would have been much better for them, and only Browder benefited because he made this into the basis of his whole campaign that the Russians had killed Magnitsky. But some of this may come up in these cases, but it seems that. But there may be other evidence as well, because there are a lot of tracks, bank accounts, and I've seen some of them where it shows how the money is going from this shell company to that company to that company, and if they have this documentation, that may be part of this. And let's see what Browder comes up with. But to be continued.
Yeah, and I mean that's the whole thing with money laundering and tax havens and this and that. I think, half of the strategy is to just make it so complicated. I think the people who are good at this are, there's a website, I think it's an American living in Russia, a guy named Helmer, is it?
John Helmer, he's excellent.
So I've read his posts sometimes, and I thought, I should really try to understand this better, the Russian oligarchs and all that. And so I have read through them, and, he gets into the weeds of, this corporation and someone, but who really controls it is that one, and they've got shell companies in this country or that country. It just makes your head hurt. I can see how a lot of people just say, okay, this is not for me, whereas that's your specialty. I mean, that's the thing that you dig into, and that you're so talented at, and persistent. I think it takes a lot of persistence and time to do it, but I think that's half of the game. Is just the more complicated you make it, the more likely you are to get away with it.
Some of the stuff, they deliberately make it complicated because they have something called layering. They have many different shell companies and bank accounts, and one thing is in British Virgin Islands, and something else is in Grand Cayman, and something else is in Switzerland, and something else is in Guernsey, and on and on and on. But you actually can make it so it's very understandable. And in fact, there was in Veselnitskaya's report, which you can get on the Judiciary Committee website that she gave them, and I put it on my website as well. She has an interesting chart, and it shows how the money flowed from one shell company to another. Some were owned in Russia, and then they went to shell companies in Cyprus, and some were owned by the Ziff Brothers, and some were owned directly by Hermitage, and how the money. She actually has something about the loans showing how Cypriot companies moved the money to the Russian companies as loans. So this was, I thought, she gave this to the Senate Judiciary Committee. They have some smart people there. Why didn't they even look at her charts and say, this is pretty interesting. Let's look into this. Well, they weren't interested. They were only interested in their Russiagate function, but they were really not interested in how the system works. The system works, of course, because it was not created by the Russians. The Russians allowed these shell companies, and I think they shouldn't. They allowed what happens is some of these regions try to get money into their region to expand, to develop their region. So they allow these shell companies to work. And the names of the shell companies are the names of local Russians, but not the real owners. And those shell companies end up moving money to shell companies, in this case in Cyprus, also not owned by real people, also fake. But in the end, the money gets moved out of Russia. I don't think that they benefit, because what happens is the real taxes aren't paid, and the money that it is earned on the stock shares, because the purpose of buying stocks low is to sell them high, right? And if this is all in a Russian shell company, what about the profits? Well, you're supposed to pay taxes on the profits. They move things out without the proper reporting. They were moving things out to Cyprus because Cyprus has a double taxation treaty with Russia. So if the shares are really owned by a company in Cyprus, even though the registration is in Russia, you pay only 5% on your profit in Russia instead of 15%, because the assumption is that you're paying the rest of it in Cyprus, and so there's an agreement between the two countries so that the investor doesn't have to pay twice. Well, Browder was moving things to Cyprus, but then out all over to his main companies were set up through the trustee HSBC bank in Guernsey. So Russia was losing on taxes. I think in the end that's what happened. So I don't think it's smart for people to allow shell companies with secret names, with not the real names, to set up in your country. I think that it just lets you in to be exploited, and that's what happened in the Browder case.
Yeah, so we'll see. They seem to be still working on repairing some of the damage and sort of recovering from that crash when everything was chaos and money was just streaming out of the country, and the whole 90s disaster. And now it's taken them 20 years to get some of that cleaned up and sort of set some things right. I doubt they'll be able to set everything right, and as far as the Magnitsky Act, you say that the Browder case continues, but the Magnitsky project, you really have to call it a project at this point, I think. From my understanding is it's not just the Magnitsky Act in the United States. He's working with countries in Europe to get similar Magnitsky Acts put in place. And there's something I've heard the term the Global Magnitsky Act. He wants the same kind of mechanism in place, pretty much.
Yes, well, there are about 5 or 6 countries that have passed these things. But it's basically a smokescreen. It's not real. The people that are put on it are just maybe some local officials and people that work in a prison or a hospital, and they are not the real enemy. The whole thing is to build a campaign to demonize Russia. That's the purpose of the Magnitsky Act. The people are just pawns in that. And the purpose of that is to prevent countries from requiring Browder to answer to justice. The prevention of him, for instance, Interpol has refused. Interpol is supposed to, if somebody is convicted as a criminal in one country, if they pass the border of another country, if they're on the red notice list, they're supposed to be arrested and returned to the first country. But Browder, what he's done with the campaign is to say it's political, and therefore I should not be, and Interpol therefore should not listen. I should not be arrested. Interpol should not pay attention, and that is, Interpol now does not pay attention to Russia, demanding that Browder be treated like other criminals who are put on this list, this red notice list. So the purpose is to ratchet up the public relations campaign in order to back up things like Interpol will not act. And also, suppose the country has passed, some country has a Magnitsky Act. If Browder goes to that country, obviously they're not going to pay attention to Interpol either, and they're not going to send him back to answer to justice. So all of this is to build a massive campaign. The guy is a con man, but he's a really smart con man. And I don't know that this has ever been done by anybody, that in order to fight criminal complaint and tax evasion complaint, you build up a big political block against that to prevent the justice system from going after you. That's what he has done. And that's why he's getting other countries. One of the people that was put on the European Union list, the European Parliament list, which, by the way, doesn't have the power to enforce it. Only the European commissioners can do this. So it's an advisory, but it's public relations. One of the people put on the list was a guy named Ponomarev. He's the guy who founded the law and accounting firm Firestone Duncan that first employed Magnitsky and had the Hermitage account. That was in the late 90s. But he left that. He was forced out by his partner, Firestone, in a case that was reported in the press, basically threats. This guy got some policemen or a relative who had been a policeman and got some people dressed up as cops. They took this guy into the woods. They threatened him. It was reported in the press at the time. He was forced out of the company that he had started. Later, and I interviewed him, by the way, and Konstantin Ponomarev. So later, he told me about how he had worked out some of the tax evasion schemes with Browder. Well, in the beginning, it wasn't a scheme because Kalmykia, this region, had said, if you hire 50% of your workers are disabled, you'll get a big tax write-off. So they told their clients about that. He said, well, other clients actually did hire some people, but Browder didn't. And we told him, you can't do this. And he said, even Magnitsky told him, you can't do this. But Browder went ahead and did it. And so later, Konstantin Ponomarev was called in 2013 to testify at the criminal trial of Browder for tax evasion. And he did. And by the way, at that point, he was a private citizen. He'd never been working for government. He'd had been a partner in a law and accounting firm, but he testified. Guess what? He is put on the Magnitsky list. How could he have anything to do with the death of Magnitsky? He had hired Magnitsky. They'd gone to the same economics college. He had hired Magnitsky for the firm. He left the firm 10 years before, about 10 years before Magnitsky died. Or maybe a little bit less. He told me he left in about 97 or 98, and Magnitsky died in 09. Oh, it was more than 10 years. He left the firm more than 10 years. He had nothing to do with Browder or Magnitsky. He's put on the Magnitsky Act because he testified in Russian court. That is outrageous. Does anybody care about that? Have people written about that? Yeah, I have. But, it's quite outrageous. That's what it's all about. It's his enemies list. The Magnitsky Act is the Browder enemies list. That's what it is. What is the reason? And then Ponomarev wrote a letter, which I have. He got a lawyer, and he wrote to the person who at the time was the head of the European Parliament, the president of it. And he explained all of this and said he wanted to get off their list. And the answer, which I also have and printed, well, I'm sorry, because this was not really a legal decision and we can't do anything about it because this doesn't have the force of law. Well, yeah, it doesn't have the force of law because they don't have that force, but it sure ruined this guy's life a lot. If it got reported in the Russian papers or on the internet sites that this guy is put on the Magnitsky list, this doesn't really help your career, does it? But that's, it's really nasty. And it shows the immorality, in this case, of this guy who was heading the European Parliament, and of the people that are complicit in this Magnitsky Act. It's an utterly immoral operation that he is doing. And I think it's basically, in some ways he's a useful idiot. He's not an idiot, but he's a useful idiot for the people who are Russophobic, because it's another way to say, oh my God, they're really terrible. Putin's really terrible. Look at what happened. And of course, it's all fakery, but they're using this as a weapon. It's a Magnitsky Act is a political weapon in the Russophobia fight against the Russians. And that's why it happened. That's the real underlying meaning of it.
Yeah, it serves several purposes. And in true con man form, he paints himself, he says, as Putin's enemy number one, as if he's a victim, when really he has, engineered this Magnitsky Act remedy for his own problems. His enemies are the people who might be able to hold him accountable. He and whoever else, was involved in I see it as sort of like, how they do corporate raiding. What happened in the 90s appeared to be like country raiding. When they moved in, the country, their currency collapses and these people move right in and start trying to strip the place like they would strip the assets of a corporation. And, they really thought that Russia would never recover enough to ever hold them accountable for it. And now that's happening. And he's created this giant mechanism to protect himself. But it's like, him making himself the victim just turns the whole story upside down, which is so, unfortunately, I'm seeing that in a lot of places, particularly around this Russiagate thing. And it's scary. It's how deep the corruption is, not just immoral. It's just, the corruption is scary. It's gotten to scary levels. I mean, I'm not so naive as to think that we're not going to always have some kind of corruption, but the level we've reached right now, it seems, I don't know, the biggest I've seen in my adult life anyway. And I appreciate your time on this and all the information that you laid out for us. We're actually going to look to collaborate with a number of people to bring some people together to tie some different big stories into this one. I don't know, I'm not sure how to even describe it, but we're going to at least pursue that because we think that that this story is possibly even bigger or has links to other larger stories that other people have investigated and are more expert in. So I'm looking forward to that, Lucy. And anything else before we want to wrap up here?
Well, there were so many little pieces of this, so I don't know that any one just fits in. But one thing I want to point out, and people who are listening to media and reading media, we don't expect the mainstream media, or at least I don't expect them to tell the truth on much of this. But the alternative media, the publications that you might expect to report on this have not. And, I'm talking about something like The Intercept. They have refused to write about this story, and other major publications that pretend to be investigative and against the what might be called establishment media, they have refused to report this story. I think people ought to start to ask them, why are you not reporting the truth about the Browder Magnitsky hoax? That's a major problem, I think, because you expect the mainstream media not to tell the truth on things where the State Department or the deep state has an interest. But I would have expected more from the alternative media and the liberal media. I don't see that.
Yeah, well, we just have to keep.
So
doing
I would end with that because you are doing this, but I have had some other. You're doing a podcast, right? So
right.
I was interviewed by the Tax Justice Network in London because I gave a speech, or was part of a panel, part speech, part panel, on the Browder story at the Offshore Alert Conference, and that's a meeting that's run for lawyers and accountants and people from government. It's not an activist group, but I was there to discuss this. And chairman of the board of the Tax Justice Network, which fights a good fight against tax evasion facilitated by the whole tax evasion, tax haven system, did a long interview with me, and that was going to be a podcast. And I was very pleased that they were going to do this because there's a need for this information to get out. And it was in November, and it was supposed to go up maybe in December, and it doesn't go up. And then I contact them, and where is it? I thought it's going up. Oh, we're doing the transcript. The person who was in charge told me we're doing the transcript, so that's why it's not up there. And so I'm waiting for this to come up there. And finally, I have this, I wrote about this on my website, and I have all the emails that I put up there. So the editor is Naomi Fowler, and she finally says to me, well, I talked to some people in London, and they know about Magnitsky, and they say what you say is not true. I said, oh, really? Who are they? And by the way, what did they say that was not I say that they said isn't true, because I will give you the evidence for everything I say. Well, I'm sorry, we're not going to do it. So Naomi Fowler, the Tax Justice Network, supposedly a really liberal organization fighting the good fight, they killed my interview. It was a terrific interview. John Christensen did it. And I had known him since 2003, because I was one of the founders of the Tax Justice Network. We founded this at the meeting in Brazil of where people had gotten together in 2003 to claim that another world is possible, and it was in Porto Alegre. And I was involved in working in New York on that, and I was on the board for a while, so they knew who I was. They killed this story. I'm wondering, why did they kill this story? Why is the Tax Justice Network podcast censoring a story on Browder by somebody who's a founding member of their organization? This is a real serious problem. The lockdown on this information is severe.
Yeah. And it's almost like, keeping track of your work and who you're talking to. I mean, how did it even get shut down? Who even knew that it was coming? That's interesting, Lucy. That's troubling. Mm-hmm. Well, this one's coming out, and it's coming out before the end of the month. I'll tell you that much. I have a certain allocation of space of how much I can upload every month, and I don't like to waste any of it. So yeah, so you don't have to worry about that.
No, I didn't worry about you.
All right, so I will link all of your information on how to find you on Twitter and your website, and we'll keep in touch, and hopefully we'll take this even further. And again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. It's really important this gets out and that you are doing it.
Okay, take care.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Lucy Komisar. Follow Lucy on Twitter at Lucy Komisar, LucyKomisar, where there is lively discussion and active participation in this investigative work. And find her work at her website, thekomisarscoop.com. The Around the Empire podcast, independent media. Your support is really important. Please pitch in, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. You can find it in many places, on any mobile podcast app, or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. And if you're listening to YouTube, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and also leave some comments for some feedback. Also follow us on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.